同志们，欢迎到我们的地图工坊。We're back in the map room. So here you have a new map to show me.
A new map.
So this map is from a different perspective. So the title is called From the Center to the Margins, the Extent of the Sinosphere.
Extents.
The extents
of the Sinosphere. That's a key. That's
true because you have two semi-hemispheres.
Right? Yeah. And not only that, but the directions are all extents.
Mm-hmm. At different degrees.
Yeah.
So it is quite a complex map.
Yeah, there's a lot of layered meanings.
And there's I think quite a bit of explanation to really grasp like the scale of this.
Exactly. So that's why I think this video will be very helpful. I mean, I do think people would benefit if we kind of devoted a whole video on this one map. So let's dive right into it.
Yeah, so maybe let's start with the centerpiece there.
The compass.
Yeah, so you have a compass.
Okay, so the compass we have here is based off of what I've seen. The Chinese had directions the same that mariners in the Mediterranean had wind directions. So, you can easily go south by southwest, east to east-west, you can have those degrees of directions, like with the east, the north, and south and west. But in the Mediterranean world, they also had like transmontane, Sirocco, I think. They had a Libico. These are directions where wind is coming from. And the mariners of the Mediterranean used this for navigating instead of saying southwest. And in the ancient world, they also had invented words for direction as well. But what's interesting here is that the Chinese use a similar thing. They knew what the directions were, like north and east and west and south, but they decided to also use the 12 earthly branches to divide the compass into 12 sections. So even north has its corresponding directional word, just like north in the Mediterranean compass is transmontane or transmontana. But anyway, so the 12 earthly branches are to do with like Chinese geomancy and stuff. So we don't need to get into that. But I just thought it was interesting when I first saw it. And then I also thought it was interesting that the Chinese have colors.
Yeah, I think it's important because the colors inform the way you painted the different countries there.
Right, yeah, exactly. So the colors on the compass kind of clue you in on how the territories on the map are grouped together. So the center is yellow, and the Chinese had this idea that around them were margins. Mm-hmm. They were always the center, around them were the margins, and they had colors for those margins. So to the north was black, and to the east was supposed to be what was called qing. But it's interesting, the Chinese, kind of like the ancient Greeks, they didn't have a word to determine blue from green. So actually, if you read the Odyssey, Homer, right? Do you remember that? Like wine-colored sea, right? Yeah. It's not blue. They didn't have blue yet. And I think a lot of people, just before they started taking to the sea for maritime activity, had blue and green conflated. And so the Chinese still have that. So the issue here is solved by me picking a greenish blue color. To the west is white, and to the south is red. And interestingly, I think the Turkic peoples have, at least I know north is black. So the Turkic peoples, I think, have either borrowed from this or there was like a shared kind of cultural thing here. But yeah, this directionality thing is very important because the Chinese assigned meaning to directions, not only just color, but to meaning. So you can see the yin yang in the bottom and the 5 elements. Now the 5 elements are actually like transitional phases. They're not equivalent to European ideas of elements or like, what do you call it?
Humors?
Yeah, humors and stuff. So one leads to another, but you see fire is related to the south. So there's like that kind of interesting, cool airbender stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But
okay, wait. So you have the middle, which is yellow, which is zhong, like
zhong is middle,
like China.
Yeah. That's what they attach themselves to, the idea. But actually, that's interesting because the Chinese really that shows you how much direction has. That shows you how much meaning direction has to Chinese culture because like at the core of it, their main identification is middle.
Right. And also, I mean, if you think of Beijing, the capital.
Yeah, it's north.
Is north here.
Yeah.
Or Nanjing with Nan.
Yeah, it's south.
The middle of the compass with the 4 directions are essentially the core of China, the Chinese territory,
Yeah.
right? And then the second layer are more of the marginal territories within still the Chinese sphere of influence, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And so those colors also
map onto
yeah.
You can see there's an issue with color conflation, and I think that's actually just a reflection of how the Chinese did it. It's to do with the yin yang thing in the bottom. It's to do with how the elements move from one to another. They are like, if we mix east with west, like white with green and blue, you'll get turquoise. So they had this weird kind of thing of like mixing the main four colors to create secondary colors and secondary associations. But yeah, these colors will show you what's on the outer rim and what's on the inner rim. Now it's important to understand though that the inner rim historically, like 2,000 years ago, was still considered outsiders. So I use this to show an irony, a historical and geographic irony, which is that what the Chinese believed were outsiders to them have now become part of the core areas of the Sinosphere.
As if there was 2 degrees.
Yeah, exactly.
So the first degree would be like Manchuria or Xinjiang or Tibet.
Yeah.
But now that has become part of the core.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Xinjiang and Tibet are on the outer core and here. But you're right.
There's still...
Yeah, there's 2 degrees. And like, for example, the Manchus are in the first degree. And it's because of like them ruling China for so long that they've become Sinicized. But in the East, that 2 degrees is interesting because it's a very continuum. Because in the East, what I call the Eastern Maritimes, the main East direction, like the countries that are associated with that, Japan and Joseon or Korea, have become so Sinicized that they're interchangeable basically. Like they write in Hanzi, and they study Confucius. They do everything that the Chinese do and might even do it better. Like they might play Go better. They might say their sword skills and technique are better, and like they're just playing Chinese people, but also saying we're not Chinese. In the other 3 directions, north, west, and south, these peoples also have this irony where they're trying to be Chinese, but they're also not. And then beyond them are the peoples who never even try to associate as being Chinese, but after periods of intensive Chinese contact are part of the Sinosphere, regardless of their choosing.
Mm-hmm. Let's just talk about the third ring actually. So in the compass you have a third ring of writings.
Yeah.
But they don't look like Chinese characters we usually encounter.
Yeah. So I found it fascinating when I came across the fact that Chinese merchants and people who use numbers regularly, not academics, but just regular people, invented their own way of writing Chinese numerals to do quick math. And it has the same benefits as Arabic numerals compared to Roman numerals. Roman numerals, you have a character for 10. Chinese characters, traditionally, you have 1 to 10 to 100. There's a character for each one. There's a character for 10, and then you add another character beside it. But the invention of 0 and then having like 1 to 9 and adding 0 to stuff, I can't explain it right now. I kind of forget the intricacies of explaining this, but digits and
it's having digits rather than
yeah. But anyway, so that quickens math, right? And that allows for faster notation. And so the Chinese actually had their equivalent to Western or like Indo-Arabic numerals already. The 0 here is the only thing that's been like obviously borrowed. But you can see that by writing quickly, they decided to write 1, 2, and 3 vertically. So this is just bearings. This is 0 to 345 or 0 to 360 by 15-degree increments. Mm-hmm. And you can easily actually get to see almost every numeral represented here because 15 increments will show you a diverse amount of notations.
That's really neat.
Yeah. But this thing died off in the 20th century. But like mid-20th century, you would still see like merchants, even in westernized Hong Kong, writing in this notation. And these notations also correspond to a numeral system used by Chinese mathematicians called the counting rods. But the counting rods are kind of like Western numerals, but they allowed you to do math the way that in the West you could, but it wasn't very practical for writing it.
Okay, so now we've covered the compass. Let's talk about like the text and the boxes you have just above it. So the colors seem to match the labels of the different areas based on direction.
Right. So I have 5 boxes here, 1 for the center and 4 for the other directions. Basically, each of these text boxes, these plaques, these color plaques, are regions in the Sinosphere, like the main regions that the Chinese use, or for their geographies, their local understanding of Serica or the Far East. And the first character is associated with direction. And the Chinese poetically call their own land Zhongtu, which means middle earth or middle soil, middle land. But to the east and west or whatever, they actually used to historically refer to not lands, but peoples, barbaric nations actually. And they had a character and word assigned to each direction. So you didn't have barbarian 4 times. You didn't have one word barbarian for all barbarians. The Eastern barbarians had their own character. Western barbarians had their own character. Southerns, which is really, it shows you how xenophobic and how centric Chinese culture was, right? But in my Altera, what happens is they quickly change that mindset and start seeing geography and start seeing the Sinosphere expanding. And so there's this kind of marginality, marshland expansion out from the center. The suffix of each of these plaques is to do with marginality, like territorial marches. So, the northern marches, you can imagine marches are usually kind of like transitional plains, kind of flat land. The reaches, it means like kind of like, it gives you the idea of like mountainous lands. The maritimes, coastal lands or like islands, archipelago. And then southern Maine's just a play off of the Spanish Main in New Spain, which is probably the least associated with marginality.
Right, and what's neat too is that you also put a little, I guess, text descriptions of these different areas as how a Chinese geographer would describe it.
Yes, so actually, okay, this is where Altera gets really cool. So I have it so that in the 19th century, Chinese geographers embrace geography as their own thing instead of just like borrowing it as a wholesale tradition from the West. And the Germans and the Germans and the French and the Americans were doing the same thing. They were starting to invent their own traditions of geography. And so I'm a big fan of choreography, as you know, and I have it so that at this point, choreography reaches them as like a thing, and they develop their own style of choreography. And I was inspired by this text called Sanhai Jin, which is a 2,000-year-old text that the Chinese have. It's a real text. And it's a bestiary, but it's also geographic. It's a bestiary in that it describes fantastical beasts and animals in faraway lands. But as Sanhai, mountain and sea, would suggest, it's about areas around the world. So it's like classifying beasts from different parts of the world. It's all fictional, and it kind of resembles like those medieval texts of like fake animals and beasts. Mm-hmm. But anyway, so I used the way that it was written down and the language. Like at this area, there are these things. I used that kind of way of doing it to do choreography. And you can see here that Jinqi it's an emperor era name, and also an emperor name. And so I pretend that in the early 20th century, this emperor patronizes this endeavor, because it's like a tradition for Chinese emperors to attach their names to these big encyclopedias or big kind of text projects. Like Siku Quanshu is like before Encyclopedia Britannica, Siku Quanshu was the biggest encyclopedia in the world. And Siku literally means 4 warehouses. There's a warehouse for histories, a warehouse for classics, a warehouse for... And so it's 4 warehouses collected. And it's associated with a specific emperor. He patronized it. But so in this case, I have it so that geography becomes the most important field and is patronized by an emperor. And that's his like legacy project. But then you can see that these texts are excerpts from chapters of that big text.
So those are actual writings.
Yeah, well, I created real writings, but this is a fictional text. So I'm pretending like I'm excerpting from a real thing.
And but you're actually describing the Altera world.
Yeah, I'm describing the Altera world, but I'm writing in the style of like a classically trained Chinese person. And the Chinese are notorious for, like, even in modern times, embracing the old way of writing. Like, Chinese novels in the 20th century only started writing kind of like the modernist writers of the English writing tradition. Before that, they decided to write in ways that are different from the way they speak. they decided to write like classical Chinese people. So if you're learning Mandarin for now, like for example, you're learning Mandarin, you wouldn't be able to read any books before the 20th century. Because even in the 1800s, those books are written as if they were written by people 1,000 years ago. So it's very archaic. Anyway, so I did get some help from my mom, who's more literate in Chinese. But I used Wiktionary, and I also copied the style of the San Haijin, which I have a copy of, like a abridged version of it. And I copied that style, and I copied the way they use certain words. I love it. And then these are the translations, associated translations. So you can see like, it's right here. It says this is a special edition for the Painted Earth collection. So it's like a National Geographic special issue, and you can see it's like it says here that they're pulling excerpts from this geography thing as an ode to it, and they're using it to like bring color to this map, right? And so you can see ellipses. These ellipses just show that they're just like trying to find things that would be relevant to the viewer of this map, right? On this side, it's showing you the map that it's drawing from. So this is a 2020, a contemporary map produced with the old style aesthetic from the mid 20th century, because they're saying we are, drawing from the aesthetics of this really famous map called the New Ming Atlas. In Chinese, it's called something else. It's called Kun Yu Qian Guo Chun Tu, which means this is an archaic word for saying world, the world map of 1,000 countries, or the Atlas of 1,000 countries, which is a play off of a real map. This Jesuit, I think, Italian Jesuit called Matteo Ricci, he created a map for the Qing, or maybe he started for the Ming and then finished with the Qing, a world map. So the Chinese had a world map a long, long time ago, and they called it the map of the 10,000 countries. But 1,000 countries is not even an exaggeration for me. That's why I decided to do 1,000 countries. Because in my world, I have just under 1,000 countries. And for those curious, I realized I actually have 160 or so Sinosphere countries. After doing this, after doing all these columns, I found out that I have just 160 countries in this area.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, because within each area, you have subdivisions.
Yeah.
Which are kind of have like a gradient of color, which goes from like most vivid to less vivid.
Yeah.
And that shows, I guess, their
association
place or association within the Sinosphere.
Yeah. So I love, as you know, I love geographic ironies and historical ironies. So it used to be that anyone outside of the center were barbaric to the Chinese. But what's happened in history, in our history as well, is that those outside of the center have become very sinicized. And when I say sinicized, I probably mean the way we use the word westernized today. In that, like, you adopt Western cultural norms, but you're still maybe, your core culture doesn't change. It's not like cultural genocide, it's like cultural imperialism, right? But in the Sinosphere, historically, in our world, it was usually, other than in the South, it was usually like a natural process. It wasn't imposed. So in the South, it's very interesting. In the South, the Chinese for many times in history tried to expand in the South, different dynasties. Whereas in the East, it was through voyages, cultural exchanges, and slowly the Easterners off the peninsulas and the archipelago wanting to embrace Sinic culture. The irony goes further in that in the North, it's invaders invading the center and then saying, hey, I actually kind of like this, and becoming Sinicized. So the Mongols and the Manchurians are famous for losing their own native culture once they settle in China. Like the second that Mongol armies settle in China, marry locally or adopt local customs and stuff, they lose touch with the original outside world. They lose touch with their externality. And then in the West, it's through periods of historical trade. These four directions historically would have been the four barbarians, but these four barbaric areas have become part of the Sinic world. And then outside of that, these kind of these secondary color associations signal that these peoples, through intensive periods of contact, are drawn in, but not necessarily Sinic. And I'll give you like a real world example of what this means. So in the outside world, these peoples use Indic scripts. So it's weird. China was like kind of the intermediary phase for exporting Indic stuff. So Buddhism goes to China and then goes out. Interestingly, a lot of Indic scripts go from India to Tibet to China and then make their way throughout. so that the Mongols, when they conquer China, they're adopting like Tibetan script for their bureaucracy. And in Southeast Asia, I guess it doesn't go through China, but in Southeast Asia, they also adopt Indic scripts, but are also kind of like, they're like part of two spheres of influence. So the outer rim it's suggesting that the Indic world has a lot of influence still. It's like a substratum. So there's two stratums together. But like, that the Indic world has less contact with peoples beyond the Himalayas. So when their culture trickles over, it's not a mutual exchange. Like Tibetans and like people in Mongolia aren't really directly influencing India, but they're taking things that were invented in India. And then they're staying in close contact with the Chinese. So there's like this kind of weird pragmatics of adopting the Indic invention of their scripts, but still being very kind of connected to the Sinic world. Whereas in the inner circle, there's no Indic scripts. So in the East, they use syllabaries that are inspired by Chinese characters. Syllabaries are like phonetic, and they mix it up with Chinese characters. But in the West, North, and South, they invent their own native syllabaries inspired by the Chinese, but they don't use Chinese characters at all. They decide to just write in syllabaries. So that just shows you like different degrees of Sinicization.
Right. So if we zoom into the map a little bit here, the background map is your classic Altera map, and then you have the Chinese characters of these different areas, countries, yeah?
Yeah. So
how did you come up with those?
First of all, let's explain what these characters are. These characters are nation signifiers. I don't have a proper term for them because this is just how I would describe it. The Chinese themselves don't translate it very well. There's usually two different ways of calling a country. The Chinese have like a land, and then they have a state. So the Zhongguo means the state of the middle. But historically they could have just said Huaxia for their country. Huaxia means land of the civilized and elegant. Same for Japan. Japan can say Riben, the land of the rising sun, or they can say Waguo or Heguo, which means the state of Yamato. So they always have these two unrelated like sets of characters. So these single characters here are all the characters that would go associated with the Guo or the Go, Japanese Go. So it means the state. And usually these characters are more archaic. So all the provinces you see here, the Chinese provinces in today, modern day China, they still use the historical ancient states of these provinces. During the autumn, spring period, or even before that, like when there were like, many states in China, these state names are still associated with these modern provinces and are used as abbreviations. When you buy a train ticket, you don't go from Shandong to Hunan. You go from Ji to Xiang. Two different places. Like you can't even guess it as a foreigner. And Chinese people all know it, and they're like, of course it's like that. And you might not learn Riben culture. You might not learn Japanese culture. You learn He culture. There's two ways of calling everything. The archaic state name is usually associated with like more poetic signifiers or abbreviations, and in people in normal talk, when they're referring to a geography, a place, they use the two-character term, like Riben, land of the rising sun. So I decided to do that and apply it whole scale to the whole Sinosphere. Those that are like long associated with the Sinosphere, like have been in it for the longest time, have both unique double character like geography term and a state term that is unique and different. But those on the outskirts, usually it's the geography term abbreviated to become the state term. That just shows you that they kind of are like less well known to Chinese. The Chinese refer to them less often. Anyway, so I used Wiktionary to transcribe these things. But what I tried to do is I tried to get that sweet, beautiful balance of phonetic and semantic preservation. The Chinese before the 20th century liked to transcribe foreign things with this system of both resembling the phonetics of that origin and then also having some kind of meaning. What they loved to do was to ascribe some kind of barbaric or derogatory term. So Mongolia today is actually still kind of derogatory, I believe. When you look at the characters from Mongolia, That's because the Mongolians don't really care. They don't have that much, but the Japanese really cared and they petitioned. There's a whole wiki page on just how the Japanese petitioned to change their name. So they're like, the character for Yamato is not dwarf, it's peace. So these characters matter a lot. Modern day Chinese, let's say Obama, it's just Obama. Alaska is just Alaska. Canada is Canada, which are nonsensical. Yeah, it's just phonetics.
Or Coca-Cola.
Yeah, Coca-Cola is different. Coca-Cola is what I was telling you, the beautiful balance. Because Coca-Cola is both a phonetics, taking the phonetics, but it's a brilliant marketing term because it means you're always thirsty. You're thirsty for cola.
Ah, okay, that's brilliant.
It's brilliant. And
what about McDonald's?
No, McDonald's bad.
Okay.
Like in Taiwan, they try to be a little witty with their transcriptions.
That's very interesting.
It's almost double speak. It's like 1980 sliding meaning into something. So etymology is always right there for you. If you really wanted to care about something, you could look at it and it'd be right there. When I said, do you think of Land of the Rising Sun when you look at Japan, the characters were Japan? They're like, no. But then I'm like, okay, but what does it mean? And they're like, oh, it just means Land of the Rising Sun. So it only takes them a moment to snap out of it and they can decipher it. Whereas for us, if we wanted to look up Germany or England, you'd have to go to Wiktionary. Like land is obvious, but angle, you have to look into the Old English and the transformation of that word. But so the Chinese, but the phonetic and semantic stuff, a lot of times were either derogatory or just badly done. They were lazy. They're like, let's just call them horse people. Like they used like very common terms for a lot of these areas because they just didn't care about knowing about these people. They didn't care about the geographies. But I have it so that a lot of these characters get updated over time. As the Chinese get to know these worlds more, they say, okay, instead of using this character, which is a homonym, so it sounds the same, why don't we use a different character that has a better meaning? So for example, Vancouver Island, right? On the west coast, there's a fog zone. So in forest fire season, you can still have camping fires on the west coast of Vancouver Island because the fog is always coming in every day. So the fog zone is going to be the inspiration for the Chalnoth's transcription, which means land of the fog. Okay?
That's brilliant.
Yeah, so...
Well, so talking about that, it's interesting that you included the Pacific Northwest in your Sinosphere.
Right. So... I have it here that the Ainu. So this legend is full of lore, by the way. Mammoths are one of the most epic ones. We don't even need to talk about Pleistocene Park and how mammoths can like change the biome of the north. But let's talk about the Ainu. The Ainu have something called the itaomachips, which is like a ship that was ocean going. Okay, so they have ocean going technology in real life. And I use that, I'm like, okay, well, if they had that real life technology, all it would take is them to make that one there and back voyage to the Pacific Northwest to not only bridge the far east with the far west, but also give like people in the Pacific Northwest knowledge of how to get to China. Because the people in the Pacific Northwest are also ocean going. Dugout canoes can go, weeks into deep blue water ocean. And we know that sometimes whaling expeditions will go without sight of land for days. Anyway, so I have it so that the Ainu bridge contact, and there's like very good trade incentives because euligan comes from is a very pungent but addicting thing when you get used to it. It's made out of candlefish, right? Or euligan, and if you burn that fish, it will light on fire like a candle. That's how much fat it has. And so that's why, like in the Pacific Northwest, they would boil it in cedar boxes and the fat would rise to the top. They would skim it off and create butter. And that fermented stinky butter was so valuable that they would trade across the Rockies for it. So you can see Ainu people are trading it. And today, actually, the people of the Pacific Northwest still love the combination of soy sauce with euligan. Just in our world, from the 1800s onwards, Chinese people were introducing soy sauce. Soy sauce and euligan is like the number one condiment for a lot of foods, especially for native peoples in the Pacific Northwest, right? And so I just thought, how great would that be for like the linkage? And also, I thought that the Ainu would be really cool people for the Pacific Northwest because the Ainu look very similar. I know they tattoo and are a little different that way, but the aesthetics of their clothing, if you look into their clothing and their designs, is very similar to the Pacific Northwest art styles, the aesthetics, the very abstract kind of shapes. And also, they like to make clothes out of bark as well. So cedar bark clothing. I forget what tree species it is for the Ainu. And then the Ainu are ocean going in a similar way. And the Ainu also carried small swords, not exactly the same as katanas, but slowly they adopted the katana thing where everyone would carry a sword. And you know that the Tlingit and the Haida slowly started developing their own sword-carrying cultures in the 1800s. It was like only a brief momentary period before like culturally they shifted again. But for a brief period, they started carrying copper daggers and swords. And also, before that, they had the knowledge of working with steel because Japanese ships would always break down and the natural currents would bring them to the Pacific Northwest. So anyways, I just thought this would be a great extension and also a great way for them to preserve their local cultures because they're on the fringe of the Sinosphere, which means they only adopt some things, whatever is beneficial for them to resist westernization. So all of them are speaking their own languages and they're using this amazing script called Fegspa, which was the script that a Tibetan monk tried to invent for the Mongols when the Mongols took over half of the world for the Yuan dynasty. It didn't stick because everyone had their own script. But here I have it so that the Ainu during the Yuan dynasty get contact with the Mongols through the Koreans. The interesting thing is the Hangul script is said to be based off of some of the aesthetics of the Fegspa script. And I'm going to have it so that the Fegspa script was being used by some common people in Korea, and the Koreans dismiss it and never adopt it, but the Ainu adopt it, and then the Ainu bring it to the Pacific Northwest. It's the perfect script for them because the Fegspa is a syllabary which is very good at adapting different consonants. It changes shapes of consonants, so each vowel can be fixed with a different consonant. Instead of using hiragana, you would need to have one character for every syllable with a different consonant. Right? In the Pacific Northwest, there's so many consonants, you have so many combinations that it will be like hundreds of characters. But here, they can bridge the vowel and the consonant so they can create really cool characters. And these characters are really good for inscriptions. They're great for stone inscriptions, and the people in the Pacific Northwest love carving in wood.
So do you think that if actual languages in the Pacific Northwest, like Smangyaq or Haida or Helcomelin, if they use the script, it would be more intuitive to read it.
Way more intuitive
versus like the Latinized scripts that like these anthropologists came up with in the 19th century.
Exactly, way better because like using numbers and the commas and look at this. Okay, look, I just decided that this would be my glottal stop. Look at this glottal stop.
That makes more sense than a interrogation point.
Yeah, right. Like, isn't this beautiful?
Question mark.
So this is how you can try. Like, it's just as long.
Wow.
But phonetically, just like the aesthetics of it, it looks like it flows really well. To me, I don't know, from a foreigner's perspective, I think it's a lot better than all these kind of like, traditionally it's all symbols and that stuff, but you can see this being like an evolution, an organic evolution, more organic, less alienating than the jump that we have from their cultures to just the Latin world. So yeah, that's the Pacific North.
Yeah, what's cool is that at least you have the characters here. Unfortunately, if you can't read Chinese, you can't pronounce it.
But the English translation is beside it.
But you can decipher it by looking at these the boxes, which is really neat. And I mean, I forgot to say at the beginning, but what an absolutely beautiful map.
Thank you.
It's really aesthetically pleasing, and it's so rich in information.
Yeah.
Plus, you have like this little twist of like epic choreographical depictions of these areas.
Yeah.
Plus the characters, plus the work of rewriting it in like the ancient style of
Chinese,
Chinese geography.
It's just layers and layers for people to peel back.
I mean, this is the kind of map that you have to look at for a while to really be able to like immerse. Yeah. But then once you're immersed in it, it's super, super cool because, I mean, it's rare to see maps where you have actually like a different cultural perspective on the world.
Yeah.
And the characters still having the meaning within the cultural context, within like the larger logic.
Yeah. So like, for example, this is the equivalent of like Westerners creating a world map where the Western areas, like Europe, North Africa, Western Asia, is well known and intimately known to like, let's say, people in England. But then when they get to India and China, they just go like, okay, they go to the local person. They go like, okay, what is your land called? Like they rely upon the knowledge of the other. Here it's the same thing. These are geographies organically created from the center by Chinese people. So you're seeing the world through their lens. But once you get out of it into these kind of like Terra Nova areas, like the brown territories or like the areas that they don't know too well, you can see they have more general ideas. So those plaques refer to whole general areas. The Chinese are notorious for like mapping in this way. If you look at ancient maps of China, they use these plaques to signify territory, but they don't use those plaques to really accurately show where the territory extends, the boundaries, right? They just go like, around here is where Guangzhou is. So they might say Guangzhou, the city, with a plaque, and it might not be accurately on where Guangzou is, right? They expect you to have some knowledge already. So here's the same thing. I use these plaques for like the outside to refer to these general areas. We can talk about those etymologies later. They're really fun.
Okay, so here just one last thing. For Chukcha, would you say Chaoguo?
Chaoguo.
Okay, so you can read it, at least the country name.
Yeah, you can read the country
name.
It's cool
because you put that pinyin in.
Yeah. I wanted to do the third pinyin too, the pinyin for the land, the double characters. Yeah. But what you need to know is that the double character, because the Europeans, when they arrived to the East, just asked the Chinese or the Japanese going like, hey, what is this country called? All of these Western names, they're close transcriptions of the Chinese or Japanese or Cantonese pronunciations. Okay, so Kirin here is Jiling.
Oh, it's Ling, the second
Ling, yeah, Jiling. And the Japanese pronounce Ji Ki. So you can see either the Europeans went to the Japanese or to the Chinese, it doesn't matter, but they got Kirin from that. So it's a close approximation. That's why I decided not to overload the map with too much information. Mm-hmm. But if you're on my Patreon, you get access to this extensive Excel. Mm-hmm. Did I show you the Excel yet?
Yeah, you did.
Yeah, the Excel has etymologies for each one and the transcriptions for each one. And the etymologies are like lore filled, like so much history. Because I'm like, because of this and this, that's why it became this and this. Mm-hmm. So I invented really convincing stories for all of these. I wanted people to think of geography as like a fun thing again. So look how exotic this sounds. Okay, beyond Lake Baikal, there is said to be the Thousand Teeth Mountains. Qinya Shan is a Thousand Teeth Mountains. Qinya could be, either the Chinese named it themselves, or it could be maybe they got it from a Russian Cossack, because Chernsky, Chin. Anyway, so the mountains are rugged and barren, but yielding plenty of gold, silver, copper, and diamonds. Here there are mammoths, which can be ridden, used for industry, and which yield ivory. The peoples of Tunguska brought these beasts across the Yukaghirs Strait in their conquest of western Alaska. In the Chinese one, it's even more epic because the Yukaghirs Strait here is written for Westerners to understand, but for the Chinese, they wrote Binghai, which means frozen sea, ice sea. Mm-hmm. So the Tunguskan peoples crossed the frozen sea to conquer Western Alaska with these mammoths. This sounds exactly like Game of Thrones, bringing dragons across to conquer Westeros. But or look at the eastern one. Look at this, the Pacific East. When sailing east from Serica to the other side of the Pacific, one finds a cordillera of coastal ranges, right? The only way to sail further east is to brave the tempestuous and wintry seas at two poles. If you really think about it, that's actually how our world works. We have a continent, a double continent or one single continent that blocks, the world in half like that, right? The only way to cross this is going through the two poles. It used to take months for sailing vessels to cross the Cape, Cape Horn. It was that dangerous. The waves were that big that it took them months, to make that one part of the journey.
And it's a treacherous passage.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of them would die.
And you can't actually go through the north.
Yeah,
so there's actually only one passage.
Exactly. Might be a good time to talk about these, the Pacific North, the Pacific East. It just means these are areas where the Chinese knew and the Japanese knew of lands beyond their Sinosphere, but which were readily in contact. So, for example, in the north, that contact point actually eventually leads to this area becoming part of the Sinosphere, the margins of it. In the south, you get historically a long period of contact, right? A long period of contact, and then eventually little exclaves, Chinese exclaves, okay? And it has something to do with the arrival of the Westerners too. The interesting thing here actually is that the terms gongsi, the modern word gongsi means company, But back in the day, that's what they used for republic. Because 共和国 means is gong. You see the prefix is the same. Gong means like common, the commonwealth.
Mm-hmm.
So you know the word commonwealth. Commonwealth can actually also be turned into company because commonwealth means we all benefit, profit together. But commonwealth is most often used for states, like political understanding. This is how gongsi is used. Before, when the Lanfang Republic is a real place actually, historically, when it was it declared in Borneo, it was a company-based, a commonwealth. It was a bunch of people trying to preserve their like mineral rights and their monopoly on certain exports that they band together and created a state, right? So it was a company state, a republic, a commonwealth. But nowadays we use the word only solely for company. But gongsis, I really like that idea, and I decided to make 11 little gongsis.
So real quick, why is that island in the Philippines called Formosa?
Oh, because I really like the name Formosa.
Didn't want Taiwan to be called Formosa.
Yeah. And then this is Palawan, and Palawan is a Portuguese colony. So it's part of the whole Catholic part, this Catholic intrusion. By the way, this is an ode to the Manila Galleons, these characters. This means 传道. Dao means circuit, and famously it used to mean province. But Dao is also Taoism, Dao, the way, the path. So, like, you know, remember the Incan provinces? Remember I used roads? So, yeah, circuit can mean province because of highways and association of highways. But here, this literally just means path, and Tran means ship. So the ship path. This is the land of the ship path, the Manila Galleon. Really quickly here, another two really cool etymologies. These two characters here both have the boat radical. Like, people actually start seeing patterns in Chinese characters when they see this, because these boat radicals are recognizable, right? These three characters all have the boat radical, and these two characters are solely used by Hokkien people. So they're Chinese characters only recognizable to Hokkien people, and together it means Mengjia. Mengjia is a Chinese transcription for an Austronesic word.
Which makes sense, given the Austronesians spreading
from Taiwan
into the Pacific.
And before that, coming from the Yangtze Delta, but also with having contact with the Hokkiens already at that point. Now, this is really cool. There's one of the most famous districts in Taipei is called Wanjia. Okay, Wanjia. Mengjia. There's two ways to pronounce it. Mengjia, Manja, or Manga in Hokkien. There's a cognate for this word in every Austronesic language. Okay, waka is the Maori word for canoe. Okay, manka, manga, banka. These are all the same for canoes, ship vessels. So it's just crazy that it preserves so well, because it's like so iconic to Austronesian people. They are the canoe people, right? So here you have the land of 10,000 canoes, and up there you have canoe station. And the ocean here, the sea here, it means 10,000 island sea, right? And here means lonely station sea. This means hot tides, warm tides. Here means the 8 tian tides. I found this really cool. Let's go back to India. So the Chinese used to call India Tianzhu, okay? And it was actually
Wu Tianzhu.
Yeah, Wu Tianzhu. Wu is 5, but Tianzhu actually was from the Persians. They transcribed the Persians who transcribed in Hind. It's interesting. Everyone associates India. Everyone associates India with the Indus River.
Yeah.
Even the Chinese coming from the east.
So why 5?
Because they got it from an old Sanskrit text. I forget what. It was like an epic, and it was an epic that described India as having 5 lands.
Wow. 5 lands or 5 rivers?
5 lands. The 5 lands of India. So the 5 Indias. Okay. Now you take that and you go here. So the Chinese call this the 8 Nicaraguas, okay? Because the Tiantai is Nicaragua here. But the 8, it's because in my world, in Nicaragua, I have all these different provinces that are ethno-linguistic, but they are grouped into 8 provinces, 8 districts. And these, like, it would correspond to, like, the Tarascan realm, the Mayan realm, and, like, these different realms. And Tiantai sounds like Tianzhu, sounds like the Indian thing. Signaling here that the Chinese see an analog.
Or a similarity.
Yeah, a similarity. And then Tai is platform or plateau. So it's like the Mesoamerican plateau, right? Yeah. And then look at how they named the seas, okay? Here they call it Waihua Sea. Waihua sounds like Nahua. Nahua is Nahuatl, like the Aztec people. But the phonetics, that's the phonetic, the semantic.
So is this really how Chinese people describe, or you've come up with it?
I've come up with it. I've extended the way they do it. Historically, they only applied this kind of depth of knowledge and like they only applied this amount of detail to people around them.
Right. So let's say like the first or second degree.
Yeah, but here you're expanding that.
You've extended that using etymology.
Yeah, so you're having a Chinese geographer being more curious about the outside world. And so here, Waihua, that phonetic already sounds like Nahua, sea of the Nahua. Yeah. But semantic, it means the outer Chinese people. Hua means civilized, but it also is a short form for Huaxia, which means the Chinese people. Land of the civilized and elegant. So you're saying they're equating, they're like, these are the Chinese people over there. They're like us. And then here is a play on Maya, Meya, which means like beautiful,
Meya Hua.
Yeah, Meya Hai. Meya Hai. Yeah.
Meya Hai.
Yeah. Anyway, and then for Milu, I really liked it. Mi means mystery. And this is actually how Peru is transcribed, but...
And you have the 4, right?
Yeah, Sik, because Tawantinsuyu means the 4 sections. Peru, the Incans call themselves the land of the 4 sections. And then here, Jiafu, the really cool thing, in real history, the Chinese applied a lot of attention to California. They have names for Californian places. San Francisco has its own Chinese name, Gold Mountain. And in California means the expanded or vast continent in the real world. But I decided to make it phonetically and semantically like California, so it means expansive or increasing prosperity. And then
which kind of fits the capitalist model, right?
Yeah, but also like it fits the mindset that people were, or the way they were selling California.
Yeah, I mean gold rush.
Yeah, everyone was selling California in that way, right?
Yeah.
The coolest thing that someone noticed on Reddit was that it applied Indonesia to the West Indies. Because the name for Indonesia is Ini in modern Chinese. But that's the Chinese being lazy. They used to have so many Chinese characters and names for Indonesia. There was a lot of toponyms for Indonesia. But they decided to call it Indies. Ini comes from the Indies, which is it's kind of messed up. So I just decided that it would apply here, the West Indies. They're like, okay, they call it the Indies, Ini. Whereas like here, it's called the 8 mandalas. Mandalas is that Sanskrit term that could be religious, but also used for political terms. In Southeast Asia, it's famously used to describe political relationships that radiate out of a city-state. So it's like a city-state that holds a mandala. It holds a sphere of influence. And all these other people in its mandala pay tribute to it. And the Chinese know Indonesia, or this whole area, Nusantara, Sumatra, as having 8 hegemonic realms. Yeah, that's those are exonyms.
That's super cool. Okay, so what about the West?
Like I found this very comical. People in the Far East writing about some kind of people like in the Far West, right? And like as a very exotic way. Like here, furthest to the west, it is said that the people are so different that there are those that are black of skin and those that are red of hair. Here we're grouping them with that exotic lens. I just thought that was cool. So there's no Pacific on the west, right? And to the west of China is just this expansive continent that keeps on going. So there's layers and layers of geographies. So of course you would understand that they would know less and less as you go west. Pretty epic, right?
Very epic, man.
Okay, wait, let me tell you what the Chinese translation for Altera is. So it doesn't really transcribe Altera. I just use Kunyu, like the old word for world, global. But Dun Dao is what I came up with for Altera. So I was like asking my mom, what would be another way of saying like second world, other world?
Dun Dao.
Yeah.
Dao is world?
The Dao is path. No, Kunyu is world. Dun Dao. You see, they both have like the same radical. This radical is to do with like movement or like walking. Dao means path, right? The way.
Oh, so it's like alternate path?
Yeah, alternate
of the earth.
Yeah, but you know what Dun means? Escape route or escapism. Is that cool?
That's even better than Altera.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
And how do you say the extents of the Sinosphere?
So this is called Huaxia Wenhua Chen. So Huaxia is like what Chinese people call like most of China is Huaxia, okay? And then Wenhua is culture.
文化，
And then Trin is circle. Trin is probably a modern word, like circle, like a sphere. It's a direct translation of the way Westerners say sphere as sphere of influence. Anyway, this is
epic.
It was fun.
This is incredible.
Yeah.
Very impressed.
And obviously, I had two very talented young graphics artists who helped me with the layout and the aesthetic filter and like kind of making it look old.
Yeah, I like the old page in the background there.
Yeah, it really helped make it come together. Like, I wouldn't have been able to get this effect without them. Like, I put a lot of work into the research and into like the content, but you know, it wouldn't have been delivered in the right way, I think. There's plenty of information related to this map on the Patreon. So if you haven't checked it out, get on the Patreon.
同学们，欢迎到我们的地图工坊。
方
地图工坊。
No, 方
Like that.
No, third tone. Fang.
Yeah.
If you do fang, it's
No,
room.
fang.
Fang. It was close. Don't worry.
Close enough, man.
Yeah. That was good.